Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving deep into the intense pressure cooker that is Australia's rental market. And we're going to use some brand new data to break down exactly what's behind the squeeze.
First up, let's just get a sense of the scale here. Almost a third of all Australian households are renters. I mean, that is a huge chunk of the population, and it's a number that's been creeping up for decades. So you can see why this is such a critical national issue.
For millions of Australians, just trying to find a place to live has become this really stressful, super competitive, and, let's be honest, expensive ordeal. A lot of people are staring down the tightest rental market in recent memory, with prices just climbing and climbing, and the number of available places, well, it's shrinking.
It's a complicated mix, right? You've got supply, you've got demand, and you've got all these aftershocks from the pandemic. But the good news is, thanks to some brand new, really detailed data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, we can actually see what's happening behind the headlines with more clarity than ever before.
Okay, let's dive right into that data with a number that really makes you stop and think. $560. This single number, believe it or not, tells a really big story.
So what is that? Well, that was the median weekly rent in the ACT, making it the most expensive place to rent in the entire country. It's kind of the peak of a trend that we're seeing everywhere. But to understand why that number is so high, we've got to look at the powerful forces that are cranking up the demand.
So let's break down the three key factors that have basically combined to squeeze the market this tightly.
It's really the definition of a perfect storm. So first, there are just fewer properties out there. Vacancy rates are at historic lows. At the exact same time, the pandemic completely changed how we live, right? It created a need for about 120,000 extra households as people search for more space. And then, to top it all off, the return of international students and migration has thrown even more fuel on the fire, especially in our biggest cities.
You know, the pandemic didn't just push rents up. It's like it hit a giant shuffle button on the whole market. At first, we saw inner-city rents in places like Sydney and Melbourne just plummet as people moved out to the regions. That, of course, caused a boom out there. But now, that trend is completely flipped, with this massive, rapid swing back as demand comes flooding right back into the cities.
Now here's where this new data gets really interesting. It uncovers this hidden story. It shows that the rental market looks completely different depending on one crucial thing, whether you're moving into a new place or just staying put.
Okay, so to really get this, we first need to know that rent gets measured in two very different ways. On one hand, you have advertised rent. That's the price you see on a listing for an empty property. But then there's CPI rent, which measures what everybody is paying, including all the people who are already in existing leases.
And this is where you can see the real tension in the market. Those advertised rents, the ones new tenants are facing, they have just skyrocketed. The overall CPI rent has also gone up, sure, but way more slowly. And that gap between the two, it's the biggest it's been in years, and it really highlights the totally different reality for people looking for a new home.
This amazing new data finally lets us answer this question with some incredible precision. And the answer is a very, very clear no. Not even close.
So get this, if you moved into a new property in early 2023, you were almost guaranteed to face a rent hike. We're talking 94% of new tenants. Now, compare that to people who stayed put. Still a high number at 71%, but significantly lower.
But wait, that's only half of it. The truly shocking difference isn't just about whether your rent went up, but by how much. And this is where the numbers get really eye-watering.
This number right here, this is basically the climax of the data. It reveals the true cost for anyone who had to find a new place to call home in early 2023.
Just let that sink in. More than 2/3 of people starting a new lease saw their rent jump by over 10%. This is the absolute sharp end of the market where the full, brutal force of those low vacancy rates is really being felt.
All right, now let's dig into the geography of this whole thing, because the pandemic has left a really lasting and surprisingly uneven mark on where rents are actually the highest.
So demand has definitely flooded back to the cities, but it's not a simple story of uniform growth everywhere. In fact, rents in some inner-city areas fell so hard during the lockdowns that many of them are still cheaper than they were before the pandemic even started.
I mean, just look at this. As of February 2023, almost half of the inner-city rentals in Sydney and a massive 62% in Melbourne were still cheaper than they were back in March 2020. That's a huge sign of just how deep those pandemic rent cuts were in our two biggest cities.
Okay, so we've looked at a ton of data, but what does all of this actually mean in the real world? Let's connect these numbers back to the real impact on Australian household budgets.
This quote from the data analysis really just hits the nail on the head. Because while rent hikes affect everyone, they absolutely do not affect everyone equally. A smaller rent increase can have a much, much bigger impact on a low-income household than an even larger increase does for a high-income one, simply because it eats up a much bigger slice of their money for other essentials like food and bills.
And the data suggests this whole situation isn't going away anytime soon. As long as the supply of available rentals stays this tight, that intense pressure on advertised rents is probably going to continue. This huge gap, between the market for new rentals and the rest of the market is really the central dynamic we need to keep watching.
So, this new data has given us incredible clarity on how we got here. But it leaves us with a really critical and frankly pretty uncomfortable question about what comes next for housing affordability right across Australia.